Hello everybody. Today I'm going to top off the oxygen tank in my Mooney Ovation. And I currently have about 650 psi of oxygen, which counting my trip up to Minnesota for the annual that's coming up, and then after the annual, flying it to New York City to pick up my daughter and fly around with her to visit various places and then come back to Florida, I would not have enough oxygen for that whole trip. So I'm going to show you what it entails. I'm sure a lot of you have done this before. Those who haven't, it's good experience. And you might decide to do it on your own, because doing it in FBO can cost quite a bit of money. It used to be a long time ago $75 to fill it up, and now it's running $100 and more. I can't remember. I haven't checked in a long time since we have our own oxygen supply, which I'll show you shortly. This is the oxygen pressure gauge in the Mooney Ovation, as well as the Bravo and Acclaim models. It's right ahead of the armrest of the pilot, and as you can see, I have about 650 to 700 psi, which according to the charts in the pilot operating handbook would not be enough for my trip up to Minnesota at altitude of say 15,000 feet, and then over to New York and fly around and then come back to Florida. The oxygen tank in the Ovation, as well as other models that have oxygen, sits in the tail cone, and I'll show you where it is shortly. All of them, when fully charged, hold 115 cubic feet of aviator oxygen, which is the same as any oxygen. Just like to call it like that. I guess the only reason to call it that is because it doesn't have any kind of oils or any other particulates, lubricants that could create fire hazard. But even if you use for welding, it's not going to have any of that, otherwise you'd have fire. So depending on the ambient pressure, the max PSI is going to be up to 2050. Of course, PV equals nRT, so the higher the pressure, higher the temperature, higher the pressure. Currently the temperature is somewhere between 75 and 80 degrees. I'll fill up to close to 2000 psi, probably a little bit lower, closer to 1975, to make sure I don't overfill the tank. This is the chart that is used to calculate the duration of the oxygen supply depending on the PSI of the tank on this axis, with either pilot only or up to pilot and 3 passengers. It's 4 people. Depending on the PSI number of passengers you have, you'll go down the graph and then come down to a particular altitude you're flying at, drop down, and it will tell you what your duration is going to be. Suppose I were to fly with 4 passengers, max tank. After you go through all that, my duration of flight at 20,000 feet, which is the ceiling of the airplane, is about 5.5 hours. I've dotted that over here. Myself with a passenger at 20,000 feet comes out to 11.5 hours, 11 to 11.5 hours. If I'm just by myself with a full tank at 20,000 feet, it's a little bit different, because you just can't go out far enough on the chart. So they give you a multiplier, and you calculate your duration at 30,000 feet with a pilot only. Turns out it's about 14 hours times 1.6 at 20,000 feet. That's about 22 hours, which is a long time. It's rare when I get up to 20,000. The oxygen tank sits in the tail cone, and I'll show you what it looks like after I open up this access panel. I have opened up the access panel, and now we'll show you the oxygen tank. 115 cubic feet of max oxygen in a built-in tank in the tail cone. And I control it being on and off right next to my left knee, ahead and below the gauge. It tells me how much oxygen I have. And that's the label, and another label. I think it needs to be checked every 7 years or taken off. I can't really remember. It's not due yet. I think it's due in a year or two. So instead of filling up at an FBO, a friend of mine, Jack, and I use this dolly with 3 oxygen tanks, large capacity tanks, that he set up a long time ago and we have used in several Moonies we were partners in that had built-in oxygen. 2 K models, that is 252s, 1 TLS and 1 Bravo. The Bravo I was partners with. I sold my half to him, and it's sitting there in the hangar. He still has it. I moved where I work, so I ended up getting my Ovation instead of sharing with his Bravo. To make the best use of the tanks, I start filling up with the one that has the lowest capacity. It'll be the middle one at 800 psi. The next one will be the one on the right, 1175 psi. And finally from the 1900 psi one, right here. And one can select which oxygen tank to use by these valves on each tank. There's a pressure gauge to indicate how much pressure one is using to fill up the tank with and what it's gotten to. Of course, at the same time, I'm watching the pressure gauge inside the cockpit to make sure that it doesn't exceed the max I want to get to, which will be somewhere between 1975 and 2000. The slower one fills up, the better it is, because as you increase the speed of filling, heat gets generated and the pressures then go up. So you're best doing this with a lot of patience and slow. So I have maneuvered the dolly to my Mooney and placed it in such a position that it is right next to the little door that has the valve on which I'm going to attach the hose of the oxygen tanks here, which is this one. So let me unscrew this nut and attach the hose. So now the oxygen dolly is attached to the built-in tank in the Mooney through this connector right here. This was a 7/16, this was a 7/16, and this nut is a 3/4. So, as I said, I'm going to pick the tank with the lowest capacity first, which is the middle one right here, 800 psi. So I'm going to slowly open it up, and we shall hear it slowly. There it goes. And the gauge reads about 800 psi. So it finished filling from the lowest tank here, which was at actually 850, not 800. And it's down to 800 now. So I'm going to close this valve, open up the next one, which is 1175, and go slow. And we're going to see it move up to in pressure as I slowly crack the valve. There it goes. And start opening more. And I can hear it filling. I'm not sure if you guys can hear the hiss. I'm gonna put it next to the tank. And next to the valve here. Well, it's completed filling from the tank that had 1175. It's down to 1050. And I have labeled the tank at 1050. Also labeled the tank that I drew down to 800 for today's date at 800. Now we're going to go fill from the fullest tank, which is 1900. So make sure both these valves are closed so I don't cross fill, and slowly open up this tank, and it should then move up to close to 1900 and start filling. Since it's at 1900, it won't reach the max of 1975, but I still need to watch it. There it goes, opening slowly. Leave it there for a while and then keep on opening once it stops filling. Again, we hear it filling. Well, we're all done, and we're at 1600 psi after having used the fullest tank. So it will be down to 1600. I'll notate that. Over here, I'll be disconnecting this after closing the valve on the tank. Gotta close it, so I'm gonna do that. And let's go verify what the ship's gauge says. And the ship's gauge says 1650 psi. So a little bit higher over here. And as I said earlier, this is where I control oxygen being on or off. It's off now, on, turning it clockwise. And they have 4 oxygen outlets, as you can see right here. 1, 2, and 1, 2 for passengers in the back. So we're back where we started from. This is closed, tight enough, not too tight, not loose. And tank is to 1650, not all the way up to 1900, but 1650 is enough to fly quite a ways. And time to put the dolly back in its place. Thank you for joining me.